Welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. We are so excited that you've joined us today, and I can't wait to introduce to you my next guest. His name is Joshua Nadeau. He is from Canada. He lives there with his beautiful wife, Aislinn. He actually runs Sword and Pencil, a design company that is involved in the creation of the Eagle and Child podcast. So it's practically his fault that we're around. He's my co-conspirator. Josh, but is absolutely talented. He's also got a brilliant brain for theology. He's got his master's in theology, and also runs his own online theology training course subscription thing that you can check out called Imago Theology, which is just incredible. Josh, you are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm a little embarrassed at those kind words. Yeah, it's like a classic. I feel like it's a classic Canadian thing to just be a little bit
bashful and
hesitant.
Yeah,
Bashful, like a bit hesitant to hear kind things about yourself.
Totally. And I'm liking the mustache. Is that a Canadian thing or is that just a Josh thing?
No, this is just a fresh thing. This is I actually forgot I had it until today, and I was like, should I shave it to look a little bit more respectable for the podcast? And I was like, no, mustaches are top tier.
It's essential. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an essential for the recording. No, I love it. Well, today, Josh, we're looking at Fyodor Dostoevsky. I knew I was going to stuff that one up. Just an incredible man, known in both secular and church circles for his incredible writing. Can you give us a little bit of a background to who this guy is? How was he sort of spiritually formed? What was his bio and where did he come from?
Totally. So Dostoevsky's history is his bio is super intense. So he was born in the 1820s, 1821, just outside Moscow. Like 100 kilometers outside of Moscow. His dad was a doctor. And the only reason I mention it is because, his dad used to run a hospital that existed for the exceptionally poor. So there'd be this is like the 1820s, it's Tsarist Russia, serfdom. So all of the city centers are super loaded, like aristocracy, people can go to the hospitals and spend their money. But in the outskirts of town, people are super poor and can't afford healthcare and stuff. So that was super cool. But before that, Dostoevsky's entire lineage, like all of his dad, his grandfather, whatever, all the way down the line were Russian Orthodox priests.
Wow.
So he grew up, so he for 200 years, apparently.
No. That's insane.
For real. It was just like the family trade, just priesting it up. So he got introduced to literature at like a young age from his nanny, who would read him fairy tales and sagas, and he was just hooked. And he learned to read and write by reading the Bible, which is wild. So he got shipped off. His early formative years, where to start? Like his early formative years were in these hospitals in really impoverished conditions. And so he saw all sorts of totally insane human experiences that have shaped his view of human nature and the world around him, and the need that people have for something bigger than themselves. And those ideas find their way into his writings, but that's way down the road. Wow. So he gets sent away to school, to a boarding school, and he didn't really fit in. He was a pale, thin dude who was described as a dreamer and stubborn and I think overly romantic. So he's a classic little goth kid. Yeah. And he didn't really fit. Yeah, right.
He's got his fringe going down here. Yeah, he's got covering half his face.
Got his emo cut.
Yeah.
Doesn't fit in. Especially because of where he came from. There's all that class hierarchy stuff, and so all the aristocracy are a little bit look down the nose at him. And in that first year of him going away, first or second year, his dad died.
Wow.
Of I mean, this is like a bit of the part of the shroud of mystery around Dostoevsky's life is like his dad either died of a heart condition, but a ton of people came forward saying his dad was murdered by his
Yeah.
serfs. So
Very
even
harsh.
though, yeah,
Mm.
even though he was like a good guy, like running that hospital, he was a jerk
Mm.
to his the serfs that, right? And so there's potentially a conspiracy for
Okay.
them to murder their dad and or their his dad, and then they could take over the land, etc.
Wow.
Um, After that, Dostoevsky moved from Moscow, where he was going to school, in St. Petersburg to get military training. Another
Mm.
thing he didn't super dig. It was all like math, science, military strategy stuff, and he's like an artsy
Doesn't
dude.
suit the emo kid.
Totally, right? He's like frail and
Yeah.
weak, and now it's just like military training. But there was like this thing that popped up, like as I was preparing for this, I was studying like, okay, what was that?
Mm.
What was school like for him? And a bunch of his teachers went on record to be like, yes, of course, like he was frail of disposition, whatever, but he also used to stand up for the outsiders and newcomers, would call
Wow.
out all sorts of like corruption at the school. So there's this little
Wow.
seed bed
Yeah.
that you can kind of see flourish down the road. Um, yeah, and then from there, this is where things start taking a turn for him. So after he graduates, he becomes a military engineer.
Wow.
During that time, he's about like 21. He publishes his first novel. So he graduates, starts
Oh.
living a pretty decadent life. Um, and he had developed seizures at this time. People think it was because of the death of his dad. So he would have
Mm.
seizures. And he started gambling a ton. And so like he's got this really like right.
How
It's
does
just
that connect?
it's
He
yeah.
has
It's just like
seizures, so he starts
seizures.
gambling.
He's yeah. Everyone who has seizures gambles.
Yeah.
I thought that was
It's a
like a
thing. Yeah.
priori knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so he then's like, oh, I'm gonna start doing what I love. I'll start writing books to make ends meet,
Mm.
to support my decadent lifestyle and my gambling. And the
Mm.
first book he wrote was a book called Poor Folk, which is
Wow.
just like a handful of letters, obviously informed by his childhood and what living
Mm.
in Tsarist Russia in the 1820s and 30s looked like.
Wow.
Um,
Mm.
and this is like a turning point in like the literary world. So there's a like a pretty famous Russian literary critic called Belinsky,
Mhm.
and he gets a hold of Poor Folk, Dostoevsky's novel, and he's like, do you know what you've done? Like you've changed. This is different. This is not like anything we've read before. So in those
Wow.
days, what people would do was like you would have people do a kind of social commentary, but it'd be situational, life and times kind of stuff. It often ended up
Mm.
being comedy, but
Okay.
Dostoevsky started doing like psychological stuff, looking at human nature.
Mm.
How do people live and act and think and move in these kinds of situations? We kind of take that stuff for granted. You know what I mean? Like every
Yes.
book and every movie that we watch and show we get obsessed with. Like we're watching House of Cards, my wife and I,
Yeah.
and it's just all subtle character development, right?
Yeah. Wow.
But back then, it just wasn't a huge thing.
Wow.
And so because of that book, he gets connected with like a socialist utopian guild.
Mm.
Two of them. So one leads to the other. He gets in with like the Bedikov circle. They're just like small time socialist utopians. And so like that time in Russia, you've got it's like czarist, so kind of aristocracy, pretty
Mm.
tyrannical, serfdom essentially. So like it's a feudal workforce, so people are just worked to the bone. And so
Mhm.
like the kind of natural overcorrection is like a socialist utopia where it's like
Yes.
people don't have to work like this. We can
Mm.
organize society in such a way that everybody flourishes. And that led him to be involved in another kind of socialist utopian circle called like the Petra. It's really hard to say all those Russian names,
Oh,
like
absolutely.
Petrashevsky circle or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, like those guys were just all about introducing people to like the Western canon, essentially, just other thoughts,
Mm.
other ideas. They were about reform. And if you are like a Tsar in that time, reform sounds a lot like revolt and revolution.
Mhm.
And so it was at that time the Tsar sent the secret police after Dostoevsky and his buddies in that circle,
Wow.
and they got arrested. They got sent to jail for 4 months, where they did this like intense investigation, and they
Yeah.
concluded at the end of 4 months that they were participating in disseminating a bunch of banned material, which is
Wow.
crazy, right? Like this is the like, I mean, we're having whatever. So just a wild thing. So the judgment that they gave was these people were to die by firing squad.
Crazy.
So they got lined up 2 days before Christmas. He's like 20, I think he's 24 or 28 at this time. 2 days before Christmas, they get lined up. I think there's 8 to 10 of them, for death by firing squad. And he kind of recounts some of what happens in his book, The Idiot, where he's like calculating how much time is going to take for them to get to his spot in line. And he concludes it's like 4 minutes till they shoot me. And he's like, I'll
Wow.
spend 2 minutes thinking about my friends, and then 2 minutes thinking about the cruelty of life in my own life. And then like it's lights out. And like miraculously, a message comes in from like a letter comes in from a messenger calling off the firing squad.
Mm.
And historians are like, this is either happenstance, but there also seems to be ideas that this entire thing was set up as kind of like a psychological torture. Because Dostoevsky was having like a huge amount of influence towards a kind of social reform.
Wow.
You hear that, Lamborghini?
Yes.
Yeah. Towards a kind of social reform. And so if you do like a kind of psychological torture that brings someone to the edge, maybe you
Mm.
shatter them. And so they
Yeah.
sent him away to work in a Siberian prison camp for 4 years. The
Mm.
journey there was like 14 days, and the people he was with wanted to commit suicide because they knew what was
Wow.
going on. And he was apparently like a little light in the darkness, like giving people
Mm.
hope, telling them that life is better than giving up, which is just insane. And when he showed up at the prison camp, they were like, this is a dangerous criminal. So he has to work harder
Mm.
than everyone else. He's shackled in by himself. And
Wow.
because he was so sickly, he spent a lot of time in like the med bay or whatever,
Mm.
where he just read his New Testament and a bunch of Charles Dickens books. And
Wow.
that was his life for 4 years. Then after that, he was sentenced to 6 years of like indentured military service. And then
Wow.
he begins his writing,
Crazy.
right?
That's crazy.
It's
Do,
insane.
do you see any of that that Christian influence? I know you were saying he's got the Charles Dickens books and the New Testament. Does that come out when he's sort of talking to the others, or is that something that's sort of just
Yeah.
in the background?
So I think all of the stuff, so like Dostoevsky is different, say, than like other saints and
Mm.
classical theologians. So like being a sort of
Mm.
artist and writer, um, he was like a deeply conflicted man. So like we'll
Mm.
chat about some of his books and the themes in
Mm.
those books, but he's not like your classic, here's the saint to emulate. He was addicted to
Yeah.
gambling. He had three
Wow.
marriages.
Wow.
And then he has this deep conviction of like the love of God
Wow.
and beauty will save the world. And so like I get the inclination reading these kinds of
Mm.
historical accounts that the hope that he brings is probably coming from that deep Russian Orthodox belief that he
Mm.
has. And when he
Mm.
writes about it in The Idiot, that's the third book that he wrote. He wrote five. I'm holding up five on two hands. He wrote like five major works.
Mm.
And so when he recounts this in The Idiot, one of the things that comes out, which we'll get into, is just what it means to be a good soul and embody Christian truth in a cruel and lost world. So, like,
Mm.
I mean, you can kind of piece together that it's his
Mm.
Christianity that informs this, like, even when he was younger, standing up for the outcast,
Mm.
befriending newcomers, standing against corruption,
Yeah.
not giving up. Like, I mean, to be fair, I am not pale, I'm not frail, not overly romantic. But I would not endure a Russian labor camp, right? So there's
Absolutely.
some
Wow.
kind of like power that he has. And then all of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff informs how he communicates through his great works of literature.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's wild.
Awesome, Josh. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah,
Maybe we
yeah,
will dive right into the works that you were
totally.
talking about. I know you were saying there's like five big works that he's
Yep,
really well known for. Can you sort of flesh them out for us?
totally. So we can just go through one by one. Please
Yeah,
ask tons of questions along the way. So
yeah.
he comes out and he writes like a kind of memoir called like Notes from the Dead. And it's kind of where people have picked up all of this thought about what his life was like in prison. But his first great work is called Notes from the Underground.
Wow.
And it tells the story of a retired civil servant who's super jaded with the world around him.
Wow.
Um, and so like at this point, he's critiquing like a political ideological movement that had crept into Russia by this time,
Mm.
which is a kind of social progressivism where like if we just make society a utopia, so he seems to be pushing against his earlier beliefs. If
Yeah.
we just make society a kind of utopia, everything will be okay. And so this character, it's kind of set up in like these little vignettes. Like he goes out to a party with a bunch of his old civil service friends, and he gets drunk and just starts poking holes in all of their ideas and beliefs. And he himself is a very like deeply tormented person. And the main idea in the book is just to say something like, even if you made the world a perfect place, you could remove all suffering, all sorts of obstacles. He just says mankind, one of the quotes from the book is mankind has a deep fascination with suffering, and that
Yes.
we will work suffering in and of ourselves, and that these
Mm.
social, progressive, utopian ideas don't take into account the darkness and reality of human nature.
That's so true.
That book for me, like I remember reading it when I was a bike courier when I read that book. It's just a small little novel. Like you could read it in like a day, if you're a kind of fast reader. And I would read it for like 15 or 20 minutes. And it kind of exposes this reality of like life is always going to be suffering. So even if you remove everything, if you can remove all sorts of this is like a deeply Christian idea, anyways. If you remove all sorts of
Yes.
obstacles, you still have yourself. And we
Mm.
often work our own self-destruction, but often if
Mm.
things are too perfect, we just like
Yeah.
we would destroy it, right?
Yeah.
We would want to destroy it.
Yeah. You still find an emptiness in it, in anything.
Totally. I mean, you can insert, I mean, this is the context that we find ourselves in right now, this debate between what kind of social world can we develop and what kind of benefit will that have on society. And so, like, I mean, look at all the super rich, bougie people, and now, like, their greatest enemies are like boredom. And so, what do they
Yeah.
do with their boredom? They cheat on their spouses, they
Wow.
beat their
Yeah. Yeah.
kids, they like indulge in alcohol because life can't be, we don't have a great war, right? We just have like this internal war. And so, that book just like made waves. People were like, what is going on? And so, yeah. So that's his first big book. I feel like I'm talking
Awesome.
too much.
No, this is brilliant. I
Okay,
don't really
okay.
know anything about Dostoevsky, so
Yeah.
I'm learning so much. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's cool. So, I mean, like, that's why I kind of chose him. I figured, I mean, I know a bit about who's on the roster. You have an amazing lineup already and amazing stuff coming. I figured going the art and literary perspective would just add a different twist.
Definitely
Um,
suits you as well as the artist.
yeah, right.
The
I
artist that
have
you
to
are. Yeah.
totally. So his next big book, so like Dostoevsky's contemporaries at this time are like Nietzsche and Tolstoy and Freud down the road, but Freud read tons of his books, and these guys
Ah,
like they just loved Dostoevsky. So
wow.
he writes the next major book he writes is called Crime and Punishment, which is like a detective book. Um, I guess I should say so. Like when Dostoevsky writes a book, it's under the guise of a narrative, but it's a philosophical treatise the entire time.
Wow.
And so his characters normally embody an ideology. And what he does is he makes the biggest opponent to what he believes to be good and true and beautiful, the most compelling, admirable, intelligent character in his book. And so which is something we can all learn, right? We often, when we come up against our enemies, we straw man them.
Yeah,
We come up with
demonize them.
characters.
Like,
Yeah, we
yeah.
demonize, and Dostoevsky venerates them. He turns them into
Wow.
saints. And then he's like, if I can't beat the best, then what's the point? And so Crime and Punishment is a book about a super poor law student called Raskolnikov. And he is like a materialist and a rationalist. So those are big ideas culminating in Russia at that time. And so his big idea is like life is rational, there is no God. This is where Nietzsche and him, like that's kind of the Nietzsche's idea of like the Ubermensch or whatever, the Superman who needs no God, God is dead. And so an indictment, I guess, Nietzsche has on the world, and he just says man has to take that place. And so Raskolnikov becomes that embodied person. He's super smart, he's attractive, but he's super poor and he can't afford to go to law school, and his family is super poor. And so his sister is toying with the idea of marrying like a tyrant who is essentially flaunting his money to take advantage of her maritally. And then someone proposes this idea to Raskolnikov, the main character, this law student, saying, there's a pawnbroker down the street, this evil old lady who extorts poor people. She's loaded. If she was just gone, you could take that money and do all sorts of good with it. And so Raskolnikov is like a materialist and as an existentialist. This is like the first couple chapters, so I'm not spoiling anything. And the book's kind of written to be like, it's a detective book, but you know who kills them, and you just, yeah, like all Dostoevsky's books are supposed to be read a bunch.
Yeah.
And so the big idea is just like Raskolnikov gets to the point where his rationalism and materialism starts bringing him into a place where he believes he's transcending morality. And so he has this utilitarian idea that if I could be a Napoleon, I could forget about what's good and ethical and moral, and I could do something that's good for my family, for the people. I could finally put all of my education and good looks and charm to use by going to law school and protecting these poor and impoverished people. So he sneaks into the old lady's house, he kills her, and he kills someone else who like stumbles in. And then the rest of the novel is just this unfolding of like the psychological trauma that happens to a person who forsakes what is good and moral and ethical and believes that they are above that for the sake of others. And so, I mean, it's an insane ride because the exposure is something like how we as humans believe, like we all kind of think the same thing, right? Like there's that, first off, that there's an arrogance in many people of being better than another person. And if only we had this, we could do what's right. And even though most of us, God willing, all of us won't go and kill somebody, about how often we hate people, we malign people, we let our jealousy and envy destroy people. And so again, this one is one of those things where Dostoevsky's drawing attention to one of the powerful ideas, I guess, in his book is going to jail, being punished for your crimes is one thing, but the punishment and torture of confessing to your own evil is much, much worse. So living in a state of unrepentance is a hell in and of itself. Right?
Yeah,
I get goosebumps a little every time I say that kind of stuff. Say it louder. Like that's one of the most Christian things I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And it's not like a phrase in a textbook. It's like, this is a real living person who you sometimes resonate with, sometimes identify with. And so like to watch that kind of what happens to a person if they are unrepentant, embodied,
Mm,
kind of sobers you up to how important it is to
yeah.
live after the good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even that first idea of, I'm above morality and stuff, it goes back to the
Right?
garden where they took it into their own hands to define what's right and wrong,
Totally.
and it
That
always ends in
narcissism.
tragedy. Yeah, yeah.
And I was listening to a lecture the other day that was just saying like the sin of exactly like what you said. The sin of the garden is narcissism,
Mm,
and redemption, like the redemption of Jesus is deny yourself and follow
wow.
me. And they're just in
Great.
stark
Yeah,
contrast, right? And so like
exactly.
Dostoevsky takes that and just brings it to these extremes. And
Mm.
often like literature has I mean I was just reading before this like some philosophy, and I
Of
love
course.
philosophy,
Yeah.
but like but you when you read a book, it lays you open in a different way than
Yeah.
like lectures and theological books. And so there's this,
Mm.
I remember reading it, there'd be moments where I just be like, hey, this is too much. This is one of Dostoevsky's, actually, the fourth one, Demons. There's a chapter that was apparently so psychologically deep and robust and exposing of human nature that his
Mm.
publishers made him take it out. And it
Wow.
only got added in posthumously, like after he died, in an
Wow.
appendix.
Wow.
Which, right?
Have you read
So
that? Have you read that chapter?
no, I haven't. I haven't
Oh,
read it. That's the only book I haven't
sounds
read. And
freaky.
I've known this
Yeah.
for ages. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this seems like the best idea of something to read, right?
Yeah. Get back to us
Um,
on that one.
yeah, yeah. So at this time, Nietzsche was saying stuff like, um, he just felt like he had nothing to learn from kinds of people like Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is like a
Hmm,
forerunner for existentialism,
okay.
and Nietzsche had no, he didn't want to spend any time contemplating psychological stuff, but he was like,
Mm,
Dostoevsky is just something different. Anyway, so his third book is called The Idiot. This is the one that we kind of touched on.
yeah.
So this book is about a guy named Prince Mishkin who is he suffers from seizures just like Dostoevsky did.
Wow. Was
And
he
he's
also a
away and
gambler at the
like
same time?
I don't know, but Dostoevsky did write a book called The Gambler.
No. That's
Yeah, and
awesome.
it's just like straight up about addiction, and people
Wow.
read it. I've read it, and well, excerpts of it, and it's just like,
Mm.
oh, this is the human mind on addiction, the little
Wow.
lies, the little
Yeah.
justifications. So Prince
Mm.
Michigan's away at like an asylum, like a sanatorium or whatever. And when he
Okay.
comes, he goes away because of the firing squad thing. So that's the story that leads up to him being in the sanatorium. And while he's on the firing squad, and they don't shoot him, he has this thought that like life is precious, life is beautiful. I
Mm.
will not waste a minute, I will not waste a moment, I won't waste a sentence, I won't waste a relationship. I will always do my best to enjoy the beauty and the gift of what life is. And so when Mishkin comes back to Russia, um, he is open and joyful and vulnerable and like kind-hearted, and he's a super intelligent guy, but everyone kind of looks at this like childlike way of life and sees him as an idiot because like nobody lives like that, right? Like he's running through the street singing and dancing, and he's petting dogs and talking to kids and like doing all the stuff that someone who would be overcome by, hey, I was at the precipice of death, I looked the abyss in the face, and
Mm.
I'm redeemed, and now I recognize how much of a gift life is.
Mm.
And so the big idea in that book, like I mentioned before, is just what does it look like? What does it feel like when someone is a good soul trying to live out a Christian truth in a
Mm.
cruel and dark and broken world? And we will always look
Wow.
stupid. We'll look like idiots
Mm.
because just the value systems are starkly different.
Mm. Yeah. It's foolishness to the world, hey.
Totally. And
Mm.
so the bit like his famous line in that book is just beauty will save the world, which is like a near and dear thing to my heart, just the idea of probably the way to wake people up out of that darkness and stupor is introducing them to a more beautiful way of life.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that there's something, even though, so that book wasn't received super well. He was going through a really tough time. He had like a ton of epileptic seizures at that time, and he was under a really tight time frame. And so he's like, I don't stand behind the novel as a novel, but the ideas behind it are still very true. Um, yeah, so that book's a banger. And then the fourth one is Demons, which I haven't read. But that's the one with
Which
like the
sounds
secret
crazy.
chapter.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like it's a just I don't actually know too much about it, but it does sound crazy. It should be the next book I read. I would have read it in preparation for this, but like his books are like 1,000 pages long.
Yeah, we'd be doing the episode next year.
Yeah, next year, 2024, after I
Yeah.
recovered.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then his last big book is like my favorite book. I actually have it up on the shelf right there. It's my
Oh,
favorite
wow.
book, Brothers Karamazov, which is like a murder mystery.
Oh, wow.
So um, the book kind of focuses on the dad who's called Fyodor and his three sons, Ivan, Dmitri, and Alyosha. Um, and in the span of the book, Dmitri gets killed and they're trying to figure out who did it and why. But the main idea behind the book is something, this is like the key thing, like I was telling you about, where Dostoevsky makes the the most the strongest opponents to his worldview the most compelling people. And
Yeah.
so Ivan in the book is a rationalist, doesn't believe in God. And there's like a couple moments in the book where, so Ivan's a rationalist, Dimitri's a hedonist, he just lives for all of his pleasure, and Alyosha is a monk. So he's just totally committed to being a good Christian. And Alyosha is not a smart person. So there's no like intellectual response. So Ivan and Alyosha meet up one day for coffee or tea or whatever. And they're talking about the death of their dad, and Alyosha's trying to kind of comfort him a little bit because of God and his mercy. And Ivan's like, well, I can't believe in a God. And Dostoevsky puts forward the strongest argument against the idea of a good God, which is human suffering. And it's at this point, a ton of the horrible experiences that Dostoevsky had as a kid find their space in his novels. So like
Wow.
there are kids who are abused by their abused by their parents. There are kids who in Russia at this time where people are super poor, parents just put their kids out in sheds in the middle of the winter, so they froze to death so they didn't have to feed
No.
them. Yeah, and
Wow.
so Ivan's telling all of this stuff,
Wow.
saying like, if there was a God that created this, like suffering is like, what do you mean? Suffering's part of the, I can't buy that.
Yeah.
And so Ivan, the most famous part of that book is this section called the Grand Inquisitor, which is like a kind of haunting dream where Jesus comes back to Earth
Wow.
and is walking around, talking to people, loving them, smiling at them. And this person, the Grand Inquisitor, who is like a kind of religious leader, so a pope-ish figure, finds Jesus and puts him in prison. And after an extended period of time, goes to visit Jesus in this dark prison. And so the Grand Inquisitor shows up at the prison and he stares into the face of Jesus. And after a moment of silence, he just starts railing into him. And the Grand Inquisitor is not kind of set up as like some demon or some monster. He's just saying stuff like, you have given people the burden of free will. You have put us in a world that has a great capacity for evil. And me, as this religious leader, I've set up structures to prevent people from being as evil as they could be. So he's introducing a kind of like altruistic tyranny in a religious sense. If you just obey these rules, and it's like, so we're taking care of poor people. We are stopping people from putting their kids in sheds
Killing
and
them.
freezing them to death.
Yeah.
Exactly, all sorts of stuff. And so this Grand Inquisitor eventually gets to the point and is rationalizing of what he's trying to do from a religious standpoint to say, we have to kill you again. Because if you're around here loving people, telling them that they're free, inviting them into your way of life, it's too dangerous. People could
Wow.
abuse it, people could take advantage of it. And Jesus, this whole time, doesn't respond. So the Grand Inquisitor finishes what he's saying, and then Jesus looks at him, and after a bit of stark divine silence, kisses him on the forehead, and it's over. And
Wow.
so at that point, Alyosha has no answer to the suffering that Ivan is kind of talking about. But as the novel progresses, that's all Alyosha tries to embody is just, well, I don't have an answer to suffering, but I can just go and love my neighbor. And Dostoevsky's idea is there is no good philosophical answer to the idea of human suffering, except for real embodied Christ-like love, and that love will save the world. And so,
Wow.
like, is it crazy?
Mm.
Anyway, so there is a murder mystery like wrapped up in that, but it's mostly like a philosophical treatise on life and free will and goodness and evil. And
Yeah.
then he died shortly after writing it. So
No.
yeah, he died
His
at like
famous last
59 years
words.
old. Totally. And I mean, those are some good last words, man.
um, do you know how he died?
Just because he was sickly. He just died. I
Yeah.
think from
He
what I
got an ingrown
remember.
toenail and died.
Yeah, totally. Just be like, oh, that was it.
Yeah.
Immunity's so low.
Yeah.
He stubbed his toe and died.
The worst. No, awesome. Oh, that's incredible. That's going to take me a while to sort of mull over all those ideas. They're so deep
Totally.
and philosophical. But how would you apply maybe his life, his work, his ideas? How do you think that they really speak to Christians today and to our world today? I know there's like a lot of apologetics in what you've said already, but yeah, how do you
Totally.
particularly see that he speaks to us today?
Um, I mean, there's fundamental things that I think are key, which is we live in a time when like dunking on people and owning people, like mic dropping on people is just like the best thing that you can do. Like it gets you your likes, it gets you your follows. But I
Yeah.
think just learning like a bit of like courtesy and love from Dostoevsky is key,
That's
where you
great.
give people the benefit of the doubt, you take their best arguments and you interact with those. And you kind of
Yeah.
be a little bit honest with what you know and what you don't know. So that's one thing. Like look at our
Great.
current moment
Yeah.
where like social media just caters to controversy and all sorts of stuff, and belittling. And so I think that's key. Um, I mean, the big stuff for me was just the idea of, so in Notes from the Underground, for example, the idea of human suffering is pretty key.
Mm-hmm.
And Dostoevsky talks about that the mystery of human existence lies not in just surviving, but to find something worth living for.
Yeah. Wow.
So he just has this idea that life is suffering. And it's not
Wow.
just about surviving through suffering, it's about finding something that transcends your suffering. Because even if your life was made perfect, his idea is that we would wreak enough havoc in our own life that we would self-destruct. And so if you find something bigger than yourself to live for,
Yeah.
you mitigate that kind of craziness,
Mm.
you know? And then his other big thing is just like beauty will save the world and love, real love. There's just no answer. There's no argument against real Christian love.
Beautiful. I
Yeah,
love that.
so do
That's
I.
awesome. Josh,
Yeah,
can you tell us? Oh, sorry.
yeah.
What were you going to say?
I was
I cut
say I
you
feel
off.
bad
Sorry.
for ranting so much.
No. Oh, this is brilliant. And so
Okay,
deep as
cool.
well. Yeah. I love his depth, but also the beauty in that depth is sort of coming through. So that's really cool.
Totally.
Can you share a little bit some of his quotes and some of the favorite quotes that you have, or
Yeah,
some of his
totally.
famous quotes that are most well known?
Yep. So there is the one like the mystery of human existence lies not in just surviving, but finding something worth living for. That's a
Mm.
key. One of my favorite ones, I have to read it because it's a little bit long,
Yeah, go for it.
is so in the Brothers Karamazov, um, there's like a priest who some of the characters go to visit to talk about some of the stuff that's going on. Like I won't spoil the entire plot of the novel. And so this priest, Father Zosima, starts talking about how love needs to govern the Christian's life, all of humanity's life. And he says this, Father Zosima says, I'm sorry I can say nothing more to console you, for love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams.
Wow.
Love in dreams is greedy for immediate action, rapidly performed, and in the sight of all men. Men will even give their lives if only the ordeal does not last long, but is soon over, with everybody looking on and applauding as though someone is on a stage. But active love is a labor and for some people, perhaps a complete way of life.
Wow.
And so his big idea is just that like loving at a distance when there's all the accolades and the padding. I mean, like, just
Mm.
think of social media, just when
Yeah,
everyone can see you standing up for these
100%.
disenfranchised people, and you just get like, oh, of course, I'll give my life for this cause as long as everybody's watching and I get the
Yeah,
standing
wow.
ovation.
Mm-hmm.
But Dostoevsky says life in action, real love is a harsh and dreadful thing, and no one will see
Wow.
you. No one will applaud you. No one is going to congratulate you, and it will probably cost your entire life to love people well.
Wow.
Just a champion. So that's
Mm.
one of my favorites. I've got a couple other ones, like I'm not
Yeah.
sure. So this is another really good one. He says, above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him,
Mm.
and so loses all respect for himself and for
Wow.
others. And having no respect, he ceases to love.
Wow. That's powerful.
Yeah. And so, like, I mean, I think that one kind of I don't know how you feel about
Mm.
this. I kind of buy into like the classic Catholic idea of like the ascent into heaven and the descent into hell.
Mm-hmm.
I like those little lies we tell ourselves on make us, like they make us less human. And when we
Wow.
start believing those lies, you know what I mean? Like, so a
Mm.
weakness of mine is whiskey. So when I am going through a bad season in my life, I tend to drink as like a escape and numb or whatever.
Mm.
Um, and there are little lies we can tell ourselves, right? We can just be like,
Mm.
it's not that bad. I'm not totally drunk. I'm
Mm.
not addicted. I'm
Mm.
not this. And if we
Yeah,
start
wow.
believing those lies, Dostoevsky's big idea is we eventually get to a place where we don't love. And one of his other ideas is that true
Mm.
hell is existing in a place where you cannot give or receive love. And
Wow.
so just that idea of like if we live those lies, we cease to be in a place of love. Dang, that guy just
Mm.
gets it, man.
Mm. Yeah, it's so true. It's almost like you become a projection of yourself. You're living in this sort of
Totally.
holographic life that's not real
Yeah,
reality. Yeah. Wow,
totally.
that's powerful. And again, a lot to think about. I think because I haven't really engaged. I've like heard a little of his quotes, read like one or two books, but I haven't really engaged a lot with Dostoevsky. So just hearing this, him as a writer in his completeness that you're presenting right now, um,
Totally.
yeah, it's really powerful, and it's a lot to sort of
To
absorb.
process. What strikes you
Yeah,
about it? Like I'm always fascinated because not a lot of people
yeah,
read. I mean, there's something about Russian authors. Like there's just
yeah,
so many famous Russian authors.
yeah.
Um, but not
And
a
that,
lot of people read them.
yeah. I don't know why I have never engaged. I think because like I've been so into the church history, like
It's
early
true.
church fathers, patristics, all that sort of stuff. He's sort of on the periphery of that, I think.
Totally.
Um, yeah, I just had never engaged and never thought to engage with him, you know? I think,
Yeah.
yeah, because, yeah, not quite sure why.
What
What made
so
you get into him? Like, why did you first dive in?
um so, so that's a good question. I'm a big reader. Like I
Yeah,
got super into like classical literature at a young age. And
yeah,
so one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, I don't know if you know who he is. He wrote Slaughterhouse-Five. He
okay.
had a really good mustache actually.
Really?
Um yeah. He
Going for
said
the
that
Kurt Vonnegut. I don't
yeah,
even remember
I'm going for
Vonnegut part.
I'm
Yeah,
going for the Tom Selleck.
yeah.
But I don't think Tom Selleck is just too handsome to
He's a
even.
very good looking man.
Yeah, he's a very good looking man. So Kurt Vonnegut just said that Brothers Karamazov just has everything you need to know about life in it. And so
Mm.
I read that quote and I was like, well, I can't, this is one of my favorite authors. I can't not read that book. And then I just went and read it and was like, what is this
Wow.
book? And it's
Yeah.
like, it's a bit of a, I mean, it's like 800 pages. It's a bit of a slog
Mm.
to get through because there's like one of the other weird things about Russian literature is just everybody goes by like a bajillion different names. So
Mm.
like every character is like 10 really long Russian names. And I'm like,
Yeah.
who are we talking about?
Yeah.
But if you can muscle your way through, like the book is just, yeah. Yeah. So
Wow.
hopefully it's enticing enough for people to pick up. Notes from the Underground is
Absolutely.
the easiest one to get
Yep.
into, I think. Short,
Wow.
good.
Good place to
Yeah,
start.
that's a good place to start. Yeah.
That's awesome. Josh, we usually finish up with a bit of a fun fact or fun story. I don't know if he had any fun in his life. It doesn't sound like
Yeah.
it. But did you come across any interesting sort of facts about him as you were studying him?
I'm trying to think. I mean, yeah, like I don't know. It's almost a sad thing to say. I don't know how much fun his life was. The dude
Yeah.
like familiar with sorrow and acquainted with
Mm,
grief, right? Like
yeah. Wow.
uh I honestly don't know. Which is just a real like I'm trying to think of something quirky like
Mm,
in his upbringing, but I can't other than I think he had a nickname when he went away to school, but I don't remember. And it's like
mm.
kind of, I don't even know if, yeah, that wasn't, it's not a funny nickname. It's just like, because he stood up for the little guy, they just kind of named him after some old saint. But
Okay.
I don't think that there's any like quirk. I mean, other than just the insane whirlwind that is his life, like
Yeah.
his dad potentially being murdered, going away to
Yeah.
Russian prison camps. The dude just lived a wild life. But if there's
Mm.
anything funny or quirky, and like I sadly I don't
We've missed it. Yeah.
get yeah,
Yeah.
we've been, yeah, it is lost in the annals of
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Oh. Thank you so much, Josh. That was absolutely brilliant. Such a
Totally.
great introduction to Dostoevsky. Definitely one to
Yeah.
get into. Is there anything else that you want to share about him before we go?
I can't really think of anything. I wish I could. Like I hope I kind of did him justice. I know that
Absolutely.
like a bunch of his like contemporaries like super were into him. I think Tolstoy was found on his deathbed reading Brothers Karamazov.
Wow.
And so like yeah, the dude was just like just an animal, but and like I think like what we said before, he like I actually think the thing I love about Dostoevsky is that deep confliction. Like sometimes when we look
Mm.
as Christians, we look at the I mean, Chesterton says like the whole purpose of life is becoming a saint. And I agree, but most of us like we don't live up to that reality. And so we can compare
Mm.
to all of our heroes, and we just do
Mm.
not stack up. And then to get confronted with like a stark character like Dostoevsky with his failed marriages and his gambling addiction and his
Mm.
sickness, and those who are sick, like those who are, say, of chronic pain or some kind of
Mm.
lingering disease that they struggle with, there's a ton of questions that come in and out of that. And I think
Yeah.
to watch someone also seek to do their best to live a Christian life in the midst of
Mm.
all of that brokenness is one of the most inspiring things to me. And like when
Yeah.
I look at Dostoevsky's life, I don't shake my fist being like, oh, you had two failed marriages. Oh,
Mm.
you were a gambler. I say thank you for like the honesty and the beauty
Mm.
that you portrayed the Christian message with,
Yeah.
despite how
Wow.
broken the world around us is. So that like
Mm.
that kind of resonates to me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's awesome. Very
cool.
cool. Well, Josh, thank you so much for explaining Dostoevsky so brilliantly today. I feel like I've just learnt so much, and it's been lovely to get your face on the camera. Usually,
Totally.
it's your drawings and stuff that are getting
Just a
out
little
there.
drawing.
Yeah, thank you for all of the amazing work that you've done and just bringing the Eagle and Child podcast to life with your
It's my pleasure.
brilliant artistry. We
I
very
mean, I love what
appreciative
you're
of
up
it.
to.
Oh,
So
thank
it
you.
makes it super easy,
Oh,
right?
thanks, Josh. Thank you so much.
Totally. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for being with us today, and thank you for everyone who's joined us on the Eagle and Child podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Eagle and Child podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.